All right. Um, so I have been asked to facilitate this meeting, and we were talking about it a little bit earlier. One of the things I guess we kind of want to introduce you to a little bit of what it's like, how we work together as an organization, because that also may shape some of the conversation that we're having and provide some context on the conversation. So one of our traditions is that we start all of our meetings with a land acknowledgement and a grounding. And so I am going to lead us in both of those this morning. And we start when I do land acknowledgements, I channel Norm Leach, who is um, anyhow, who's a great guy. And Norm does his land acknowledgements by saying, we begin by acknowledging the land because the land was here before we were, and the land will continue to be here long after we are gone. And in fact, we only exist as people because the land saw fit to raise us up. So when we are acknowledging the land, we are not acknowledging lines on a map. We are acknowledging the interconnected relationship of us with the environment and all our relations. And we start our meetings by acknowledging the land as a reminder to be in right relations and a reminder of our right place on the planet. Because everything that we need, everything that sustains us, everything that we experience comes from the land and returns to the land, including our bodies. And so with that knowledge comes an obligation of care and an obligation to be in right relations with all of our relations to the extent possible. And that means healing harms when and where they occur, because we also acknowledge that lots of our relationships have been harmed. Our relationships with indigenous cultures, our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with the land itself, have all been and continue to be harmed. And so we start with a land acknowledgement as a sort of a nudge to do what we can, where we can, when we can, to heal those relationships, starting with ourselves, starting with how we work together and how we are with ourselves and with each other. And in doing so, we acknowledge that we are dipping into an ancient tradition, a wisdom tradition that has been handed down through time immemorial, through lots of different indigenous cultures. And we are grateful that they are still willing to share that knowledge with us, and that we take that as an obligation to use that knowledge well. And so with that, I invite us to actually ground ourselves and bring ourselves into the present moment with each other. And there are lots of different ways that we do that. And today I want to do it actually through the check-in. And so I encourage us all just to, before we start, take a moment to feel your body in the chair. Just feel the weight of gravity holding you in place. Take a few nice, slow, deep breaths. Just becoming aware of the breath that's always with you. Aware of taking in fresh energy with the in-breath and letting go of what no longer serves you with the out-breath. New energy coming in and letting go of anything that keeps you from being present on the out-breath. And as a way of just sort of checking in with each other, I'm wondering what it is that might be, because given the nature of the world today, and all that is going on in our lives individually and collectively, what is it that we might need to put on a shelf for a little bit so that we can be here with each other. What is it that might be getting in the way of being present, and that you're willing to put aside or put down so that we can actually be here with each other for the next hour or so. And I'll start the circle as I see it is Becca, Roland, and Elliot. And oh, well, I'm putting aside some of the Monday morning hectic back to it, that feeling. And I am trying to put aside, and actually, as a kind of leading this meeting, is trying to facilitate it, I'm going to ask for some support in keeping us focused, because how do we want to describe it? The meltdown that is the US is um, weighing heavily with me. And I feel it's often a tension for me, because I feel like what we're doing on the day to day is in response to what we're seeing on the global scale, and trying to keep everything in the right perspective can sometimes be challenging. So that's where I'm starting off, and over to you, Becca.
Thank you, Ben. I am just returning from a 2-week writing retreat, and so I'm sort of in that uh, ramping up again, but trying to maintain some of the sense of spaciousness, and feeling behind, but trying to um, be present. So I'm, yeah, trying to set aside all the undone tasks, and yeah, and the meltdown that is the US is a good way to put it. It's trying to not plunge headlong into freak out mode about all the things that could be about to totally break in my life, but also not ignore that possibility. Over to Roland.
I am putting aside the sense of anxiety for a catering gig that was a bit last minute and is happening tomorrow, and I'm not focusing on that. I'm focusing on this, and that this is also important, and that don't be swayed by external circumstances thing. Uh, and also acknowledging the interconnection between things, because there on how much of that anxiety is actually about the catering, and how much of it is about sort of global affairs, and how much of it is about, these little earthquakes that have been happening the last couple of weeks. And we felt one this morning, was not big, but I felt it. It wasn't very nearby, and uh, and trying to move things forward here for the project, so that we can actually get to doing the project. Um, and yeah, so I'm putting all of that aside. So my list is stopped, because I realized as I was going through my list, I was actually getting into it. So my list is stopped. So over to you, Elliot.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm just getting back to it after a week away. I was in Wisconsin writing the U.S. Multi-state bar exam for 2 days, which has been a grueling undertaking while running a legal practice, and obviously is um, kind of rife with some sense of tension with regards to our two countries right now. So the timing of it was interesting, even although I've been preparing, one way or another for the last year, and that seemed to things seem to have changed in a way that we never would have guessed a year ago. So trying to process what that means for us as a practice, as well as personally, among, what's the earthquakes that are occurring geopolitically over even the last 72 hours. It is, so yeah, and also I'm just decompressing from studying in every waking hour that I wasn't working over the last 3 months. So there seems to be yeah, that kind of the wake of just that kind of intensive preparation is still kind of, I'm feeling the ripples of it, I guess. But yeah, definitely trying to get back to work, and then we're heading to for a short vacation that I haven't had one in quite some time. So next week we'll be off. So I've got a little tight window of having to be productive, and then I'll have a little bit of time to decompress.
And can I ask, how's the recovery from your injury? Is that still
Yeah,
issue?
I'm still suffering some migraines,
Mhm.
more periodically, or more frequently than I had in the past. So for instance, after writing the bar exam, I was in transit with just a crushing migraine all day on Thursday. So yeah, it seems like, and then I've still had sleep difficulties over the last months. So there still seems to be something going on, but I am kind of able to focus when I need to, and continue with the practice, which I'm grateful for. But yeah, there seems to have been some repercussions that are a little bit more long term, maybe. But I'm kind of 90%, I'd say, back, or 80 or 90% back. So I'm grateful for that, because it was a pretty serious situation in December.
Mm.
Yeah, and it could take a long time to heal from those things, I've heard.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. So yeah, I'm still just physio and everything like that, and so yeah, hopefully it'll heal over time.
Yep.
Mm.
But thanks for asking. I appreciate that.
All right. Well, it sounds like we're all kind of in a very similar place. And so we won't go over, oftentimes in meetings, we go over our meeting agreements, and I'm not going to go over them, but I am going to bring we lead with kindness and curiosity and compassion, because I feel like I know I would like some compassion today and some kindness. So I'm willing to offer that up all the way around. Probably can't go wrong with it.
And can
Becca?
we just ask Elliot, how long do you have allocated for us today for this meeting?
I have to 11:30, which was, I guess, the calendar invite. But I could extend another 15 minutes if need be. I have a meeting at noon our time.
You're on the West Coast, right? Hey, Bill.
I'm in
Hello.
Alberta, so it's 10:30 right now, 10:28 right
Oh,
now.
okay.
Okay, cool. Okay, good. I was like, oh, so we're at time? Okay. I'm getting my time zones off.
Yeah.
Hi, Bill.
Hello, everyone. Sorry I was a little late. I got called into a meeting by a cabinet secretary here and I couldn't get out of it.
That's a legitimate excuse.
Well, as Rebecca would know, state budgets are a mess right now with everything happening at the federal government level, and it's the Department of Financial Institutions here. So yeah, I've had a lot of emergency meetings in the last, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. As someone said, the last 4 weeks is the longest year I've ever lived. Yeah, it sure feels that way. Anyway, I won't get any further into that, but sorry I'm a little bit late. Elliot, hopefully you told everybody I was going to be a little bit late.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect.
And we took a little extra time actually just doing a little check-in. And because like you were saying, I think we've all been experiencing really a very long year in the last 4 weeks. So just getting a little sense of where we're all coming from. And what I have as our agenda today, what I'm proposing is, in the email that Becca sent, we had a couple, we just need some basic education around some legal things.
Mhm.
And let's start with those because I think it'll be, just tell us how this works. And we're pretty quick learners. And then we wanted to talk a little bit more about how, and when we get there, I'll kind of go around so that we each have a chance to sort of share, our perspectives on it. But I think we're trying to do some creative problem solving here. And we want to find a way of leaning into your experience to help with some of that problem solving. And I think we've been going back and forth on sort of detailing things, and it feels like maybe we've been missing some of the bigger questions. So opening up that conversation. So let's start with, I'm just gonna, um, uh, I've got to play with my screens here, sorry. And um, so in terms of the basic stuff, explain to us a little bit more about share redemption, and in particular, redemption as opposed to buying and selling of shares. Like how do they relate? So let's start with that. So tell us what we need to know about redemptions.
I can probably start out with that. So a redemption is basically just a buyback of shares from the co-op in this sense, in this case, co-op or corporation, the issuer. So basically, the redeeming is we're buying those shares back. Those shares then cease to exist. They're terminated. They go into the ether of the co-op's asset base. So it's not as if the co-op is now holding those shares. They basically are terminated and absorbed. And so that's basically just an option for, if you there's no, with these kinds of issuances, there's no very liquid market for share purchases, right? And it's not a very fungible type of property. So that's why it's often a default that people want to know, or investors want to know, okay, when can, what are the terms or conditions upon which the corporation is obliged to redeem my shares? And in other words, if I want out and there's no market, then the corporation or the co-op in this case will have to buy me out. And what does that mean? Do they have to buy me out? Is there a delay? Is it 2, 3 years? Before they have to do anything, and they can just hold on, and I have to hold on to it in the meantime. When that time is up, do they have to buy it back at the amount I paid for it, or do they have to buy it back at the fair market value, judged by the corporate asset base or whatever valuation method you have for the co-op as a whole. And at that point, it could either be less or more than the face value. Right. And so that's the far more, and often that's where you get into kind of like, venture capital interests, where you're really after the appreciation of the shares more than you are dividends or something like that. So those are important terms for investors that they'll look to. Just, what's my exit strategy essentially? What's my default exit strategy? And so in terms of the actual sale of shares to others, it's because it's an exempt market. You have to those exemptions will apply also to sales. So it's not as if once you do one issuance, now there's an open market for purchase for transactions regarding the shares. No, they have to still comply, kind of one step removed, but still comply with the exemption. So that means family and friends, accredited investors, etc. And we always build in, because this is a requirement to protect the co-op or the corporation, the approval of the board of directors like for a transfer, for instance, of shares, which could be a sale to a prospective member.
Is that a condition? Is that part of it being not open market? Is that, the board approval actually indicates that this is kind of not an
Yeah,
open
it's
market
an
thing?
indication that you're not creating a secondary market. And so you're maintaining some strings attached. You're also sending a very strong signal to investors that yes, there's no secondary market here for you to play with. You still have to comply with our governance documents, and we then have to take a look at the exemptions that may be in play when for approving that transfer, because we still carry some liability as
Right.
the issuer for that transfer to ensure that you're not doing anything to create a secondary market or facilitating a secondary market.
Okay,
And
and
you,
go ahead.
well, I'm going to say, and you get into the question a little bit about approval of sales. And so, yes, so the regulations, so there is that responsibility to ensure that anyone who purchases the share from a previous member who qualified for the exemption continues to qualify for that exemption. So as Elliot said, it gives the board some oversight, but you can use that to help ensure, though, that the new shareholder has a consistent mission and vision. I'll put those two together so that they're not just there to earn a profit. And so it does give you some ability to make sure that that person holds a consistent view of what the mission and vision is for Lifeboat. So,
Cool.
so I was just jumping ahead to try to answer that question since you had that there. And Rebecca,
And-
looks like you have your hand up for the question.
Yeah, can you remind me what kinds of things are we talking about when we're using the word exemptions?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's
Elliot, go ahead.
exemptions pursuant to the Securities Act. So these are securities exemptions. So the default in securities law is that when you are issuing securities, so shares, but other units of equity could be included there, or even convertible loans, depending if they meet the definition of securities. But let's just say shares for now. It's an abstract concept. So when you're issuing those, the default position is you need to provide a large disclosure document because it's considered a public issuance. You can issue to anybody in the whole planet, but you have to have this very, very extensive disclosure document. We avoid that because we're not doing an initial public offering, and because it is extremely expensive to do, to comply with, because you're talking audited financials, you're talking very rigorous and robust regulatory disclosure procedures. So often you will see those kinds of, they're called prospectus, those documents, costing in the range of $100,000. You can do them, but they're very expensive. But then you can list on like the TSX, on stock exchange, et cetera, right? But again, there's a bunch of administrative complexity to that as well. So what we do is, but there's exemptions to that act, right? So the act just covers the one thing, but it says unless otherwise exempt. The exemptions in Canada are located in a national instrument called National Instrument 45106, and it lists various exemptions to that requirement. The main exemptions that we deal with are, at first blush, we're dealing with like a private issuer exemption, which is if it's 50 beneficial owners or less, you don't actually have to register with the Securities Commission. You can, as long as there's some other compliance mechanisms in there, but basically it's a very, very light regulatory touch because the circle is very small and close to the founders and the control person. So they have this kind of, it's just your inner circle or your very small community, and they are deemed to have some kind of intuitive understanding of the risks involved in investing with you. So it's just too small for the Securities Commission to be concerned with. Now, there are other exemptions. Accredited investors are wealthy individuals with a minimum income or asset base, and there's a list of meeting those credentials, and we build those into our agreements so that they have to check the boxes, initial the boxes. But generally speaking, we're talking about people that are earning like $200,000 net, or $300,000 with a spouse, or they have an asset base of like $5 million. Wealthy people, or organizations. That's also include organizations. And then there's control persons, so that's you guys, and employees and contractors that are familiar with the operations because they're in them. It doesn't include just regular shareholders though, because then it would kind of defeat the purpose of it. It's basically, again, proximity to operations of the business. There's a minimum amount investment, but usually what we're dealing, and then there's family and friends. Again, family and friends are those close friends, business associates, and family that have known you for an extended period of time in more than just a Facebook or social media setting, and are just deemed to be, and there's no bright line test for that, but what they look for is how long have you known the person, have you had kind of, closer interpersonal connections over those years. But generally speaking, it's length of time knowing people that they look to first. So yeah, so there's some basic ones. There's some other ones, but basically family and friends, accredited investor, control persons through the private issuer investment. That's the starting place for your first startup raise for most people, because it's a good way to walk before you run. Because you get to learn the basics of these securities exemptions, work with them, raise capital. We're talking like, let's say $250,000. That's a good like vehicle for raising $250,000 just to start up, just to prove your concept, prove you can get some investors on board, prove that you can get some capital raised. And then what we usually recommend is going to another exemption called the offering memorandum exemption, and that's the mini prospectus. So instead of 100, 150 pages, you're talking 35 pages of disclosure about the business, about the founders, the directors, the intent of the raise, conditions, pertinent clauses in the constating documents, just all of that. That's in one place, and usually you just append that to a subscription agreement that covers all the exemptions I've already listed. And you can go out in the world and you can give that to people as long as you give them this offering memorandum with the subscription agreement. You can go out a bit broader than your family and friends, for instance. You can go out into the world, and there's some rules there, but it's fairly broad. But the kicker is you need to have audited financials annually, which as you know is a little bit of money. We're talking, I don't know, in the realm of $8,000 annually. So you need to have audited financials included in that package. So that's where it can be a little bit expensive for people starting up. And often when we're talking about offering memorandum, getting it done, we can work in collaboration more than a lot of law firms do. But that typically ends up being, a 10 to, and I think we've talked about this before, but a 10 to $20,000 hit once you're all said and done in terms of the back and forth and drafting the document, reviewing the document, closing in on communication strategies, and various other kind of ancillary items that need to be compliant with it. So yeah, those are the kind of main exemptions, and those are all in, if you wanted to review them, again, National Instrument 45106, and the companion policy explains them a little bit more deeply. So, but that's generally what we work with in startups like the one that you're building. You're muted. Okay.
A couple detail-y questions. Is the 50 beneficial owners or less, does that exclude accredited investors, control persons, and friends and family? Or
No,
is
that's
it total?
everybody. That's
So everyone.
Yeah, so with private issuer is a good question. It actually lists all of those. It needs to be any one of those. It also is, and then at the end of the list, you'll see not a member of the public. And you may ask, okay, well, what does that mean? And everybody asks that question, and it's not clear. I've looked at the case law, I've looked at the decisions of the Securities Commission, I've talked with securities lawyers, I've talked with the commission, and it's a bit of a subjective test. So again, it's clearly you're not a member of the public if you're friend and family, but you are a member of the public if you don't know them at all, right? This is a complete stranger. So I would suggest that not a member of the public really means like, are they a member of a closer network of yours? They may not be dyed-in-the-wool family or your childhood best friend, but they, for some reason, because of by virtue of a closer knit network. So, for instance, a small town, and you're just issuing to members of that small town. They know the general store that you're trying to acquire, or the business, or the land, or the property, something like that. They have that in kind of that proximity to the issue, that they are not deemed to be a member of the public, because you're not trying to sell somebody in Newfoundland or California. that has
Mhm.
no understanding about what the subject matter is,
Mhm.
other than what your word is. So that's it's a bit vague, but it's basically how do you justify that raise? And I think it's much easier if you can say, well, this is a close-knit network that we've known, or a small community that is familiar with what we're trying to do, and so that applies, and it's not just anybody on the internet.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's just not somebody you pulled off the street.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because I'm thinking, uh, depending on, we were thinking that probably this would be 50 or fewer. Like, there's no desire in this going beyond at least what we're talking about for this one property. We were hoping to keep those numbers under 50 anyhow, forever. Not as a stage one, stage two kind of thing. All
So
right, so that's good information. And that also then, so, and likewise, I think this answers a question about redemption, because I think what I'm hearing is often redemptions are offered as an exit strategy to comfort potential investors, but it's not a requirement.
You have to redeem.
You have
It
to
is a
redeem.
legal requirement.
Okay.
But of course, if it's equity, you don't have to redeem if it would make you insolvent. In
Right.
fact, you can't redeem if it would
Okay.
make you insolvent. So if you don't have revenue and an asset base over your liabilities to cover a redemption or several redemptions, then actually as a board, you cannot approve a redemption that would cause you to be insolvent.
Right.
So that is the protection. That's the protection on equity. Not the same when it's debt, obviously, right? You can default on debt and then they can foreclose. So that's actually a nice part of equity, is it does give you that flexibility of if things haven't gone to expectation, you buy yourself a little bit of time. It doesn't last forever, but it does offer more flexibility from the issuer side.
why doesn't it last forever? Or, I mean, do you at some point have to sell the property or sell your assets in order to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, it will at some point a credible oppression action would probably arise, where the investor can say, like, it's been 10 years and they refuse to redeem, and there's no revenue in the business, nothing's happening, and I can't get my money out.
Right.
You're oppressing me as a part owner of this as of this company, and I deserve, in fairness, to be out of this. You can't hold on to money forever. So yeah, that's kind of I think the default for a shareholder. It's oppression actions aren't um, they're a little bit gray areas, right, in terms of kind of when they will succeed and when they won't. But I think you open yourself up to them over extended period of time if you refuse to redeem, and.
Right. So, and we were talking about this kind of from the beginning about I mean, one of the ways that I put this early on was you're placing a 10-year bet. And because I'm wondering if, can we actually factor that into the redemption, that sort of at there's a window after which, if we're not solvent, we sell the place and the investors get their money back. Because that was always kind of the plan. If we can make it work, then it continues on. If it doesn't work,
Right.
we sell the property and everyone's made whole. And that was kind of our initial comfort zone around investment, was you're investing in part in real estate. So that doesn't go away as long as there's some mechanism. So I guess that we
Yeah,
could
just
factor that into our actual redemption language, right?
could you want to be careful how you say that? Because just when I was going through your what I would call the articles, just you want to be careful how you state the language, because you said the shareholders will be paid their par value. Par value is a nominal value that's attached to the shares at the beginning, but after that, the value fluctuates. And depending on how you do financially, you may be paying them back less than what they actually invested at the outset. Hopefully not. But so you want to be careful to use language that basically says you pay them back out of remaining assets, as opposed to making this commitment right up front. We're going to pay you back what you invested in the cooperative, because that is, depending on how things go, that may be a commitment you just cannot keep. And you don't want to open up then the potential for litigation there. I'll also note, just because you have Class A, B, and C shares, that the 50, Elliot, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Class C shares, which are the community participants, there's no membership fee, there's no investment. They're not going to be counted, I don't think, Elliot, in the 50. The 50 are going to be those. Yeah, that's why I'm wondering about that, just
Yeah,
because of the way this is written. Because that's more like a membership as opposed to a person investing in the cooperative. Class A is pretty clear, it's part of the 50. Class B is kind of on that edge. So just based on Elliot's security analysis, we'll want to look at how that Class A and Class B and Class C is defined.
yeah, it's not. I would say the clearest understanding I have is that, unfortunately, and that's why I always say, like, you got to keep it pretty close knit to begin with. When you're talking about equity, any equity ownership interest, whether it's $1 or it's 100,000 or $5 million, it's considered
Right.
beneficial ownership. So that's why you're gonna have to be careful about how many members, like nominal memberships or shares, you send out in the world, because technically it is an ownership interest.
Well,
It is a security. So you may want to instead do something like a membership program
right.
that
That's
isn't
where I'm headed.
connected to the
Yep.
equity of the company, of the actual issuer, but is a method to participate that is, something less than we're issuing a share.
Yeah, because
So,
it's again, the Class C, there's no equity ownership, but you do define it as a share, and a regulator is going to consider it a share.
Yeah.
And that's why we may want to use a little bit different terminology.
yeah, totally. And that's just, a big, big asterisk beside all that share stuff is
Yep.
we were just trying to kind of present, here's conceptually what we're talking about, and
Yep.
however we need to massage that. So with a membership program, then I'm just thinking in terms of the co-op, one member, one vote part of it, would the membership program then not get them that vote in the organization? Or would it, how would that work?
Because you do attach votes and you've got a structure to those votes based on what I read.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So I think it'll just be a little bit further analysis by Elliot and me, just to make sure that what's put in place, whatever is finalized here, doesn't violate that securities exemption and lead
Cool.
you into potential jeopardy.
Cool.
There's a
Well,
way,
and I think, sorry, go ahead.
is there a way to give these members a vote without giving them shares that would blow up the 50?
Yeah, the awkward part is if they get a vote, then they have a similar standing to those who actually are in the investor class, and regulators typically have issues with that. And so we have to figure out different ways that they can participate. And sometimes they're called participation agreements or participation something certificates, as opposed to shares that then would give them some say. But we just have to make sure we don't, if you think you're going to get close to those 50 as actual equity investors, then we definitely have to redefine the Class B and the Class C. So it
Well,
just depends whether you think there's a chance we'll get close to that 50 number. Because we don't ever want to fall
actually,
outside that exemption unless we purposely do it, and we've planned for that.
yeah. Well, and there's a part of me that is thinking there are other really good reasons for what we're doing to be limited to 50 folk anyhow. Which just have to do with, there's something called the Dunbar numbers, and has to do with the effectiveness of different size groups. Anyhow, so I think we can leave that aside, and I think we've understood too our values.
Yeah, I just highlight that as an issue.
Yeah, and I think we're going to come back to that. That kind of gets into the juicy part. So the one other, actually, before we move on, Becca and Roland, do you have any other questions around the redemption shares part?
Yeah, so the timeline for redemption can be as long as we say it, we want it to be, as but just knowing that we can get into that oppression.
Yeah, I mean, we've got, it's interesting. There's a case right now. I'm on the board of Calgary Co-op, and there's FCL is we just left FCL, but we still have our equity in FCL. And when we left, and this is all part of the public record, this is part of the litigation. When we
Right.
left, they changed their rules of redemption from like I think it was 3 years to 20 years.
Hmm.
So we entered into the this called way back when, in the 60s or something like that, under a certain rules of redemption, and then they changed them to for obvious reasons. I think they basically we're the biggest equity holder, and I think we've got $170 million in or something like that, and they're able to hold on to that money, and even just the interest of deferring it over a few years that's going to take for litigation is worth it in terms of the legal costs.
Hmm.
But we do have a very credible oppression action, right? So, but that's in large part because they changed it afterwards, right? So, what are our reasonable expectations going in, and what are they now? Even though they had it approved by all the members, is that oppressive to our reasonable expectations as a shareholder? And we're arguing yes, it is. It's
Yeah.
not determined yet, but I do think that's distinct from an issue where you're saying, okay, we're at first instance saying 10 years to redeem. So you go in understanding that this is a longer play.
Uh-huh.
You're informed about that as a prospective investor before. You understand the risks that you may not get this out for 10 years, right? As
Got it.
opposed to changing it after the fact. So yeah, just as a little bit of an anecdote, Rebecca, I think you're fine if you set that at the first. Now, I think it could have a chilling effect on investors' expectations. Usually, they expect 3 tops 5 years to be able to get for an exit. But if you think you have investors that are fine with 10-year hold, then there's nothing stopping you from doing that. And I don't think it's oppressive as long as it's communicated up front.
And that doesn't stop them from selling their share to somebody else, provided it fits within the exemptions.
Correct. Yes, and it's approved by the board.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, cool. Any other questions on this topic? The next one is ridiculously simple, I think. And there's just all this mumbo jumbo language in there about adjourned meetings. And it's something I just lifted from I don't know where. And I couldn't understand it. And we don't understand it. And so what do we need to know about the adjourned meeting clause thing?
Do we want to just pull that up to be a bit more
Yeah.
specific here? What we're
I have the document open, but whoever gets there
Can you
first.
share it, maybe? Or I mean, I did pull the link, but
Yeah, he can share his screen.
Oh, actually,
whoever
yeah.
can-
Let me I'm going to do a search for. I think this is the one. The chair of the general meeting may, and if directed by the members, must adjourn the meeting to another time and or place, but no business may be transacted at any adjourned meeting other than the business left unfinished at the meeting from which the adjournment took place. I
yeah,
think
so that
that's
just
the
means once you've made a decision to adjourn, you can't then deal with other business
Right.
at that same meeting.
so the continuation of the meeting sticks with the original agenda, can't add any other things.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, so this happened in BC Tree Fruits. So a name I know that's familiar to you.
Hmm.
And in that case, there was a dispute between certain members, and this has also been publicly reported, and the board of directors. And at one point, they moved to adjourn the meeting, and the dissenters had a majority, and so the meeting adjourned. But they reconvened on a later date, but they could only bring up those issues that were on the first meeting agenda. So no new issues could be discussed. They wanted new issues, they'd have to do a petition for requisition for a special general meeting and then put additional issues on, but you're just limited. It's rarely ever happens I just mentioned BC tree fruit, and Rebecca, you were eating a little bit. I've got a fruit piece in my mouth because it's lunchtime in Madison, Wisconsin. But it rarely ever happens. So I wouldn't get really hung up on it. It's just when you have unhappy members, they don't like the direction the meeting's going in, they could move to adjourn the meeting. But in 35 years, I've only ever seen it happen once, and that was BC tree fruits.
But so I think where the confusion comes in is that the phrase when it says, but no business may be transacted at any adjourned meeting other than blah blah blah.
Yeah, once the meeting's adjourned, it's done.
Adjourned meeting in that clause refers to the resumption of the meeting at another time and place. It's still
Right.
called the adjourned meeting, even though
Correct.
it is now
Correct.
started up again.
Right.
Okay.
No
Brad,
longer
Narrow,
adjourned.
limited business. Yep.
Yeah.
got
The
it.
until
It's the
recently
continuation
previously
of that
adjourned.
Yeah, there's a Latin phrase, sine die. So if you adjourn sine die, you're just done. And then you got to go through the process of setting up the next meeting. This is one where there's an adjourned meeting. So you haven't adjourned sine die. You still have business to transact. You do that at a later date. Again, it rarely ever happens.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
So I think that's what I have on the list of the kind of legal questions that like the educational questions that we wanted. I
Ben,
think.
you had under 3, what are par values? Can they be changed? We've got that answered. Like that we shouldn't be saying.
Gonna fluctuate. Yeah, don't tie redemption to par value.
But then there's this other thing. Can we use undispersed dividends? I don't even, not sure.
Oh, right. So this was, and I think this is a larger question around what are the other ways of determining the redemption value of a share? And the one thing that I read about somewhere, and it was just sort of in passing, but it was, I want to say, unredeemed dividends,
Undispersed.
undispersed dividends, as a way of basically augmenting the value of the share. Or that's so anyhow, what we were kind of hoping to say was, I think the phrase that you gave us that, paid back from the remaining assets, which would mean that it would accrue the value based on. Anyhow, that's the language in there that we would look to you for some advice on language to say, like, how do you assess the accrued value
Yes.
of the
Yeah,
share?
because the one, sorry, Elliot, were you gonna say
Oh,
something?
sorry, Bill.
The one thing is there's a concept of unclaimed property. So you've issued a dividend, but you can't find that person. And so that those dollars remain within your surplus. The question is, and or Elliot will go back and look at the BC Co-ops Act. They're typically, after a certain amount of time, that money goes to the province. So because you can't benefit from that unclaimed property. In Wisconsin, for example, we got a change in state law so that unclaimed property can actually be used for scholarships and for education and training of co-ops generally. But in most states and in most provinces, if I recall correctly, that after a certain amount of time, that goes to the province, becomes part of the province's treasury. And so that's the one thing, Elliot, either you or I, most likely you, will need to check out, just see how unclaimed property is handled in BC.
Well, this was we're not proposing that we go in that direction. It was just a phrase that was heard. So
Yeah,
it sounds like that isn't something we want to do.
It's also like this year it would become more clear once you have an understanding from your accountant how
Right.
you're proceeding with revenue in any given year, right? So there might be reasons why you would allocate a certain amount to dividends but not pay it out. If that's the decision you make with the accountant largely for tax reasons or with the approval of your members / shareholders, investors, you wouldn't pay it out, but you would allocate it to each of your shareholders, what they're entitled to in the event they are dispersed. So you take that amount of capital out of the general pool of assets,
Right.
and that's now allocated to a particular investment that hasn't been paid out. But when they leave, they would be entitled to that. So that's what they're talking about, undispersed is that you've actually made you've made actually an allocation to the capital account probably of that investor shareholder. So you've taken it out of the general pool. Now, when you're talking about like a winding down or dissolution or sale, you're talking about kind of how do we disperse the net assets proportionately or fairly amongst shareholders, and that's a kind of a general pool question as opposed to this undispersed patronage or dividends. So just different understandings of kind of which pool we've allocated things into according to our accounting processes. So it's a little bit abstract right now, but on an annual basis, you will have a clear understanding of where things lie in terms of assets and liabilities, and then it would become potentially relevant.
Yeah, and the modern trend on co-ops is not to allocate in a member's name if you're not going to pay it out.
Mhm.
And so that's because otherwise, if there is a liquidation, that's what they would get after any claims by creditors are settled. But it's just the modern trend is to try to avoid allocating in a specific member's name. And there are some tax reasons for that too.
So then where does it get allocated instead?
Surplus initially, so it's in your capital reserves.
Mhm.
And so as an investor, one of the things I'm most interested in, because I'm invested in, well, have preferred shares in some cooperatives, is I check their balance sheet to make sure that in the event that there needs to be a payout, that they have the financial reserves to do that.
So then one of the things we want to look at, a consideration is how much debt we allow in the, because there's one of the terms in there is how much debt the board can take on without specific
Yeah.
approval. And then that would be
Then
one of those things
100,000
as an
for
investor. Yeah, I would, because then
Yeah.
that is taking away from the equity, which
Mhm.
then limits your payout if there's dissolution.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Any other educational type questions? So then the bigger conversation that we're hoping to have is really just thinking about, we're trying to put out, we've been trying to create something that moves towards something like a commons. And we're trying to find legal structures that will kind of get as close to that as possible, given the current, legal context that we're in. And and I think the best way to do this, since I know this is kind of abstract and trying to figure out how we can put some, muscle on the bone here, is I'm going to do a little bit, but then I'm going to pass over to Becca and Roland too, just to see what aspects you want to note. And I kind of feel like the short form for me is that we want to avoid the risk of rent taking for investors, right? We want to avoid that the people who are doing the work are expected to do, or that the land itself is expected to produce above and beyond what is its carrying capacity. And instead to actually, and also to allow for fair compensation for the people who are doing the work, and figuring out how to balance those sorts of that kind of balance point. I'm being redundant. So, we're trying to figure out a way of allowing people to invest where they're not losing their investment. It's not a charity. It's not a land trust where you're just kind of giving the money and or the equity value to some abstract public good. You're still retaining a sense of ownership in the commons, which is part of some of this is based on Eleanor Ostrom's work on, how to have effective rules on the commons. And so we want people to have a stake in it, to feel a sense of ownership, but for that ownership not to then come with an expectation that other people are going to then have to owe you money because of that upfront. Or, and that's why we're playing with the language around the different shares, like that there are different ways of different forms of equity, which isn't simply monetary, that, labor is a form of equity or, could be considered. So we're just trying to look for what's the easiest way of doing that, what's the most effective way of doing that, that still, makes sense in our current legal framework. And part of the challenge is, that our legal framework, starts with private property as, so in some sense, we're trying to find a legal way of undermining one of those basic legal principles. So that's a bit of a challenge. And I think I'll stop there and then just pass over to Becca and then to Roland to see what else you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add is, and we still want to be able to raise enough money to buy the land. And so
Right.
how do we do it in a way that I think this under this segment of the email of bigger questions, number 1C is like, how do we make it possible for ordinary people to invest? I mean, whether they're accredited or not, even, I mean, my husband and I have enough wealth to be accredited investors, but that doesn't mean we have enough to, because of our disabled kids and stuff, it doesn't mean we have enough to just,
Give it away. Yeah.
way. And so yeah, and values wise, I totally agree with the wanting to move towards the commons. And is there a way to have our cake and eat it too, or I don't know, be moving in a direction, starting from where the legal system is now and the oppressive economic system, but be moving in a less oppressive direction, especially to the people doing the actual work and caring for the land. Roland?
Yeah, so I turned around and looked because I was looking to see if I have Eleanor's book still on my bookshelf here. And I think I just returned it a couple months ago to the UW library, but I've done a fair amount of reading at Eleanor Ostrom's work. So and I've done some work in data commons and got actually a couple of presentations coming up on data commons coming up. But just to let you know, I'm familiar with Eleanor's work.
Cool.
Well, from my part, I'm always a little concerned that the way I think and the language that I use is so far removed from the way we actually need to talk about things in this that I'm a little hesitant, but I think that it is in thinking about, and I haven't read Eleanor Ostrom's work, but what I'm able to glean from it, from hearing about it a lot, is that the commons, the spirit of the commons is acknowledging the role that everybody plays or everything plays in the functioning of a system, and that each role is actually as important as the other. So there are no, quote, normal people. There are no average people. Everybody plays a role. So we're trying to figure out, or I'm trying to figure out, how that can be acknowledged and honored. And from what I can see, it is for people who feel like they are outside of the norm, who are above the norm, it is exchanging that sense of privilege for connection, to acknowledge that they also are part of a system, and how to be a more functioning part of the system, trying to avoid essentialist kind of language. And I think that this is something we've internally agreed needs more discussion, but it's actually being able to really agree on what the core principles are, because in trying to reimagine something, a different or a system that is to the side or parallel, it is I think it's really easy to fall back into a dominant way of doing things.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that I've been trying to um, uh, champion is being able to build in ways of helping us not slide back into old patterns that we're seeking to change.
Mhm.
That you know, I think of the project as an experiment. You know, the 10 years is that we have this proposal, this is how we think things can work, and we need this amount of time to be able to
Yep.
produce results.
Mhm.
So yeah, I guess it's, what do you call it, Ben? Center lines and guardrails.
Right. Yeah.
And so that the whole legal aspect of it um, uh, becomes becomes an ally instead of something that we have to work around.
Mhm.
So that's what I wanted to add.
And,
Yeah,
and go
I
ahead.
mean, I hear you because I work closely with the tribes of Wisconsin, and they don't operate under a colonial type legal structure. And I'm teaching their legislatures how to function as legislatures. And I can't use the legal concepts that we have in the law that we inherited basically from Great Britain. And so I'm in a totally different, and they're very much more like a commons. And so I'm functioning in that kind of legal structure as the tribes recognize it, as opposed to what the state of Wisconsin or the American United States government would recognize. And the challenge we have is to take the philosophy and the culture that you want to create and fit it into what the British Columbia laws are,
Mhm.
and to try to be creative so that you can still accomplish what it is you're trying to accomplish, but yet you've got a legal entity that's going to be recognized by the province. And
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
always the challenge. And one of the things that Elliot, I'm kind of talking, just cut me off when you feel like you want to, but just in terms of the ownership structure, if you're providing labor, you're providing capital. Just because it isn't dollars, you're providing capital. And that is a capital contribution. And there are ways to recognize that in a British Columbia legal structure, which is to basically set up a class of shares for those who've contributed labor, or like Rebecca, who's contributed some of the startup money, those types of things. So that can be recognized in a share structure. Because when I went through what you're proposing, that was one of the things that I thought was seemed to be missing to me, is how do you accommodate folks like you who are providing the labor and the upfront financing? And to me, that would be a different share of stock. And that's pretty common, that
Mhm.
those who initially get involved in a cooperative venture will say, because we did the hard part, we get different voting rights, we get different financial rights than everybody else. And those who join later get a little bit of a diminished financial and governance rights, because really the main two things you're allocating in cooperative, any corporation, are financial and governance rights.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I was going to just mention is you may want to look at incorporating a share, because in this case, you are an equity owner, a share class, sorry, for those who are contributing labor and other things of value to the cooperative, but aren't necessarily buying those initial, I forget whether it's $1,600 shares.
That's the whole Class B. So
Yep.
that was the intention behind it, was that,
That's what I understood it to be, but I wanted to check because there you have a membership fee, but you don't have capital. But I think one of the things you might want to do, though, is recognize in that Class B that these are individuals who've contributed capital, but it's been in the form of labor or otherwise.
yeah. Well, and partly
That's
that
not
was
read in there at this point.
okay. And that was kind of the end, and the financial contribution for the Class B shares was this recognition that we also want people to have some skin in the game, right?
Right,
So in terms
right.
of, so it's not, you don't just show up on the first day and do some labor and get the share, but there has to be some sort
Yeah.
of commitment to the longer thing. So I think we're talking the The same language, yeah,
Yep.
Becca.
So, Bill, are you saying that is can labor that's been done for 3 or 4 years in preparation for a launch be included as capital rather than just like
Mhm.
the time, like on day one, Ben and Roland's labor and somebody else who just moved there would be the same amount of time, but it
Right.
seems
No,
like
yeah, so typically the way that's handled is there is a separate share and it may be different from your Class B. I don't know. We need to talk about that further. But where you have a class of shares that are allocated only to those who provided the original labor or the original financial capital, and they get different governance and voting rights because you're taking on the greatest risk.
and would
And so
that
they're, yeah, go ahead.
labor and the initial capital, that would be one class, both of those kinds of,
It
or
could be, or it could be separate classes, those who provide labor, those who provided financial capital.
but I thought there was some comment from Elliot that we needed to only have one class or something.
I think we want community services status. We can't be a community services co-op with more than one class.
Do we want to go to that question next, or Elliot, did you have other stuff to say about this whole thing?
No, I think Bill's covered the general principles there. Look, we do have a lot of flexibility with how we recognize capital contribution. And if you tell us, we want to make sure that we get out what we put in, we can structure a class that way. It's just how to reconcile that class with governance is a little bit more of the tricky situation, I guess, or a little bit that's getting into the weeds a little bit. And other, rights and restrictions, as we've talked about, redemption hold periods, et cetera. What kind of comfort do those investors need as a class? And so as long as we explicate that out, we can provide that. There are certain risks, perhaps to that. For instance, like Bill's discussed with par value, it's risk to the issuer. But if that's a risk that the issuer wants to take on in an informed way, for instance, you definitely get out what you put in, even if that could put us in a trying situation, we can do that. You can also do debt. I mean, that is it's a safer method of investing for investors.
Except that
But yeah, then there are, it tips the scales towards that, and et cetera. So anyways, it's just.
and I would say that, probably my absolute primary motivation is to avoid any debt situation, because that's basically just rent, right? That puts us into the impossible situation that we're trying to avoid from the beginning. And this is just coming from, trying to buy farmland for a farming operation. The debt that you carry will, there is no business case for, regenerate. And we've seen this again and again of people try to do good farming, but the debt causes them to start compromising all their choices. So that's why, anyhow, that's what we're trying to avoid, is that whole idea of being indebted and some people making money because they started off with more money than we did. So yeah, I mean, I think we are talking about the same thing. What you were describing, Bill, in terms of figuring out how we put a container around that other philosophical
Right.
way of working. And I'm going to say this out loud, and I'm only speaking for myself here, but and I'm saying it out loud to see whether or not Roland and Becca nod. I do not have the expectation that the bylaws, the articles of association will solve all of our problems. And I think that I am very confident in our ability to maintain the culture and the governance system that will prevent most of these things from even being an issue. But I want to make sure that we don't leave ourselves hanging open,
Right.
where somebody finds their way in and is inscrutable and uses some little
Right.
bylaw that we forgot about as a way of
Right.
screwing the whole thing. Because I think ultimately our culture the bylaws, how often do people actually go back to the bylaws? It's usually only when something horrible has happened, right? So, you know, I'm not looking to the bylaws to take care of everything, including, I'm going to say this out loud, you know, there's a lot of talk about this will be chilling to investors. And I would like to chill out a lot of investors who I would be worried about torpedoing this because they don't feel like they're getting enough money back. So, you know, probably I am not so worried about it being chilling to potential. And if we're talking about potential investors who are thinking about their financial return, that should be chilled a little bit. But if we're
Right.
talking about investors like, you know, Balan's mom or Becca, who we want to make sure are not left in a precarious position, then we want to make sure that that's all accounted for. So
Right.
anyhow,
And
Roland.
I just wanted to also say, keeping in mind the number of people that we're actually talking about for this particular project, we're not looking to have a lot of people. So it's a small number of people who get it
Mhm.
or who want to get it. And then there's also so I think really keeping in mind the number of people might be helpful. And there was another, oh, for me, one of the things that's important is part of the reason why I want to go into this level of detail is that, and because part of the project for me is rethinking the way that we are on the land together, is also the replicability of the project.
Mhm. Right.
So this is
Mhm.
also an offering to the greater good. It's not just that I'm trying to get my little chunk of land so that I can, you know,
Yeah.
sit on my stoop with my shotgun and tell everybody else to go away.
That's what I'm in for.
Yeah, there's already a number of people in the network who aren't necessarily going to invest in this piece of land, but are interested in how this is
Hmm.
legally done so that they might apply
Yep.
it to their project. I just want to do a time check.
Mhm.
Almost do people have Elliot said before you got here, Bill, Elliot said he could potentially go up to another half hour. Do you have that flexibility, Bill, or do you guys?
Yeah, I think I do. I'm hungry, but other than that, no, I think I do.
Well,
So,
and
I mean, I'll keep eating fruit snacks.
Or we could just schedule another meeting.
that's what I'm actually thinking, because Becca and I, we talked about, we're probably not going to get,
Yeah.
I feel like we got our education, and that actually was really helpful because some of those details around that, you know, par values and share
Hmm.
structures and things like that, that's actually really, really useful. And I feel like we do have some sort of common understanding of where we're trying to go. And I think
Yep.
it is probably a question of just setting a time before we schedule another time. I guess it's just, are there any other questions, or what are people thinking in terms of next steps?
I mean, one of the things I'd like to know is, do you want a way of, oh, how do I say this? Basically protecting your interests, because I keep going back to some of the statements you made in our earlier meetings that I think Ben and Roland, you want to make sure you're protected in this. Rebecca, you want to make sure you're protected. That's why I offer up this idea of a different share of class. There's a balancing, because if you take too much financial rights and too much governance rights, it's going to make harder for investors to see what value is in it for them, because then they may lose control and they become basically a minority shareholder and feel like they're not really a limited partner, let's put it that way, and feel like they don't really have any role in governance. So there is a balancing there, but I think it would be worthwhile for you to go back and think about that question is, what, to the extent that you want to protect yourself, I'm going to use that term because that's what I heard before, what level financial and governance rights would you want to have? And then Elliot and I can always figure out how to legally protect that in the current structure, but it has to be consistent with your overall values and the view that you have for this. And so it's a risk. It's a basically it's there's a risk here. How much do you want to mitigate that risk? Or are you willing to let some of that risk just happen, with the idea that everybody who's going to get involved in this is going to share the same mission and vision, and therefore you're not going to have this conflict. So, because unfortunately I get involved in a lot of companies, cooperatives that get set up. Everybody is all in the same wavelength, but later on there's a dispute and suddenly you got a problem and you're trying to figure out how do we resolve this within the articles and bylaws. So I tend, and I'm getting my PhD in risk, so I tend to think in risk anyway, but that's the one thing that I think it would be worthwhile for the three of you to have a little bit more discussion on that.
Yeah.
Sorry if I use too many words to get to the conclusion. Discuss that further.
No. And I think that, my shoot from the hip feeling is what I think it's what you were talking about earlier in recognizing that the labor is a form of capital. That's for me, my sense of protection is just to make sure that the labor isn't appropriated, right? Ignored. And I don't want special governance status based on being one of the first ones involved, because I already have it because I set up the governance system and I know where all the loopholes are.
Right.
But I mean, I think that, for me, in terms of my protection, it really is about recognizing the value of the work that's being done and having that turn into equity in some way, and how and from part of the challenge I think of is how does that change over time? When some people are showing up with more cash and some people are showing up with more effort to put into it. And in the end, there's still an equity. And how do people get paid back, or how does that balance work?
Right.
But I think I heard Bill sort of telling us we should discuss that
Have that conversation, yeah.
before we
because you've created value here. So how do you want that value handled?
Yeah.
So next step is for us to add that question to our internal discussion list.
Yep.
Elliot,
because I didn't see it reflected in really what had been drafted so far. So that's why I brought that up. And sorry, we got off on a tangent. I don't think it was a tangent because I think it is kind of a central issue here, but I didn't see it reflected in what's been written so far.
Cool.
Elliot, did you have something to say about next steps?
Yeah, I agree with Bill. I think just just to boil it down, I think you need to just get the essential terms of what it's going to take for investors to join, to put their money in. And we can put that into a share class. So for instance, Rebecca, that's a great conversation for you all to have, to say, okay, this is kind of my bare minimum in terms of the protection I need to invest. And that will probably be shared by other investors, and we can build that into a share class. And that sounds like the conversation is advanced in that regard since our last meeting. So I think having that discussion amongst yourselves and saying kind of here's the minimum conditions that we need to meet in order to get these investors in. We can work with that, and we will make sure that gets into and meets your governance and principles as well. And we get that into a share class though, so we can move forward and make sure that we can start getting some capital in, right? But it is that negotiation is as important as setting up, all of the more ethical and abstract concerns sometimes. This is kind of where it gets to a finer detail, and it's critical to move to get there. And I think you're approaching it, but it's something ultimately that's a negotiation with your prospective investors, and you're going to be the first ones to do that. So you'll be able to kind of get, I think, most of the way there just with another discussion. And if you have questions on how do we do this, how do we put this into the wording, or how to structure that in bits and pieces as you go forward, feel free to reach out before we have another meeting, and we can consider that and give some advice.
All right.
So how soon, this is sort of a question for Ben and Roland, how soon do you think we want to meet with Bill and Elliot again? Because we have our regular meeting this Friday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's talk it over then. We'll have the conversation on Friday and then see whether or not we're ready to schedule another one.
Okay. I mean, I would rather have something in the books and then postpone it if we needed to, then have to do the schedule by email.
Yeah, fair
Okay.
enough.
I just
I'm
need to
gone
take
next week. Yeah.
So you're thinking something, Rebecca, example out like 3 weeks?
Um, let's see.
You have your meeting this Friday, so that's 1 week.
Yeah.
We meet
And then
every
you need to
other,
just figure out,
yeah, we meet every other week. And I
okay,
think the question actually is how many meetings do we think would be necessary for us to
right,
be able to have another meeting?
exactly.
And
Uh,
I would say, to give us at least a little bit of space, I would say it might take us a couple of meetings. And then the
okay.
discussion
Yeah.
might be, do we want to have more than, do we want to meet more frequently than every other week to be able
That's why I
to?
set out a minimum of 3 weeks, but it might be longer than that. I don't know. You tell us.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So how about sometime either the last week of March or the first week of April? How about the first week of April? Um, we we would have a regular meeting that April 4th at 10:30 Pacific, 12:30 Central. Would that time work for you, Bill and Elliot?
On Friday the 4th, because Tuesday's election day and I'm up on the ballot. So have to
Friday the
avoid
4th,
Tuesday. Friday the 4th. Yeah, so that would be, you said 12:30
12:30 Central,
Central and
30.
Madison time? Yeah, I think that would work for me.
Yeah, that'll work for me.
Okay, so that would give us 2 meetings amongst ourselves, and then does that make sense to you, Ben, to invite them to our April 4th meeting? April 4th meeting. You're on mute, Ben.
That sounds good to me.
Okay, great. So
And I
can you?
might have more time if I get dethroned as school board president. I'm unopposed, so I probably won't be, but yeah. For the first time in 3 elections, I'm unopposed.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, we've got
Any
a date
close
schedule.
want to do, Ben?
Pardon?
Any closing that you want us to do?
Actually, why not once around, last thoughts for the good of the cause. Becca, over to you. And then we'll loop in. It'll be Becca, Roland, Elliot, Bill, then me. So last thoughts.
I just feeling gratitude for this meeting. It feels great to meet with both of you together. I feel like you each bring important strengths to this, and looking forward to continuing to build on this momentum. Hold on.
Well, everything is a process, including me. I need time to let things sink in. I need time to let the neck muscles relax. And yeah, I think that's it. Over to Elliot.
I think it's great to see all of you and see that there's the continued progress in fighting the good fight of trying to set up a very innovative and community-minded enterprise. It's not easy to try to be so innovative with what you're doing in terms of governance, but also the resources and the money that it takes, and how to do it in the fairest way that connects with your values in the deepest way. So yeah, I just applaud you for staying in this and continuing to develop the concept and the model, and also appreciative that you're including us in the process going forward too, and yeah, looking forward to seeing what we can do into the spring.
And I'll put an exclamation point on what Elliot just said and note, I teach the co-op class at the University of Saskatchewan, so I have maximum of 15 third-year law students. And a lot of what we're talking about, and they're all pretty much 26 years old. And the reason why they're in the class, I've been told it's the most popular class at the University of Saskatchewan Law School, is because of the values associated with cooperatives, and that they're looking to be involved in businesses that have values, because so much of the business world doesn't. They say they do, but they really don't. And so I'm always looking for new models to help teach these students and inspire these students. So that's why I very much appreciate being part of this conversation, because we are working within the legal structure that we talked about, but trying to find flexibility in that structure that really allows you to accomplish, like I've said, mission and vision multiple times today, that really help you achieve the mission and vision that you really want to. So like Elliot said, thank you for allowing us to be part of this discussion.
Mhm. Well, and right back at you. Thanks for being part of this discussion. And it just all it makes me think of the expression circle in the square, you know, that and yeah, the urgency of what we are trying to do just, you know, kind of increases every day. So the relevance of what we're doing, I think, is also so I think the good news is let's get this wrapped up, because there are lots of people out there who I think want to be part of something like this, whether here or elsewhere. So, you know, the sooner that we can get this model actually from model to thing, the better. So hopefully April 4th we'll just be like, okay, let's so let's print this thing. All right. Looking forward to it. Thanks both of you for your time.
You bet. Thank you all. We'll look forward to seeing you on April 4th.
Good luck on
Bye-bye.
April 1st, Bill.
Yeah, thank you. Should be okay. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Great to see y'all. See ya.